This is Sirens, a new series brought to you by the Ladies of Bombshell, where we dissect the institutions of American power. Join us as we sound the alarm on technology, governance, and national security issues, and maybe sometimes lure some men to their deaths. I'm Loren DeYoung-Schulman.
I'm Erin Simpson.
And I'm Radha Iyengar-Plum.
And we are back after a brief winter's nap at the end of 2025, as we all found ourselves full of wine, cheese, Christmas cheer, eggnog in your coffee, eggnog and Bailey's in your coffee, whatever it was that was your jam. So as a transition slowly into the 2026 times, I wanted to ask if you guys have any New Year's Eve or day traditions that are sort of either outside the norm or that are worth mentioning here.
Not especially. I did have friends who have since left Washington, but used to throw this awesome New Year's Eve dinner party. And it was like the first like grown up New Year's Eve that I ever really like went to. And so it was, kind of immaculate food, but also like high class cocktails. And there was usually like a trivia game of the year. And it was, not completely out of the norm, but definitely a tradition that I very much miss.
So we have a slightly extended approach or compressed approach, depending on the particular year, to New Year's Eve, in which we pick countries across the world that have different time zones in which New Year's happens and then watch the fireworks in those countries. This started when my children were little and I was highly sleep deprived and would be like, let's do New Year's Eve at like 6 p.m. and then I'll go to bed. Like, what countries is it New Year's Eve at 6 p.m.? And we were in California time. Anyway, so we try to pick different countries, even the European time zone, you have lots of countries you can pick from. This year we picked France for the sort of Europe time zone, and I highly recommend the French fireworks. I was like, well, this looks like a good time. They go on for a long time. They're behind the Arc de Triomphe. It's very scenic and exciting and high adventure. So this is.
Do you think these other countries do fireworks at New Year's because they don't have a 4th of July? Because I don't associate fireworks with New Year's.
Oh,
you don't live in my neighborhood, clearly.
I was like, I totally do, I guess.
My dog would be up like 17 times that night being like, hey, did you know there's fireworks? I'm like, yeah, I did. Go to sleep.
Yeah, go back to bed.
Our traditions are not super exciting. I guess I have two that are probably fairly common across the United States, but bring a lot of people joy. The first is making black-eyed peas on New Year's Day, which I usually do with collard greens and sausage and a side of cornbread, all of which are things that are meant to bring you luck over the course of the next year. I've done that every year for a very long period of time. And this year, guys, I got Rancho Gordo as a subscription, which is a bean subscription for holidays. I am so jazzed. I'm a bean person, and there's a Rancho Gordo Facebook group that is just a bunch of really happy people talking about beans. It's incredible. A second thing, which again, a good portion of America does, is just occasionally checking in on Anderson Cooper and Andy, whose last name totally escapes me, from Bravo. Thank you. Andy Cohen on CNN, as they proceed to get further and more toasted as the evening goes on. I feel like this year did not really live up to last year when had Rafe Fiennes doing the whole So Demure TikTok video. I loved that. But it was still, listening to Anderson Cooper giggle, it's not the worst way to move into the next year. So with that, we are moving on to because we've been gone for a month, there's a whole lot to catch up on. And frankly, there's a whole lot to catch up on just in the last 36 hours. So let's just pretend that most of the last 3 weeks didn't happen and start at the beginning with It's a Drill, both as what are the kind of hot newsy topics that if one were to go to cocktail parties in Washington or be invited to them, one would be talking about. And with that, I'll start with Radha.
Sure. Well, I couldn't pick after a month being gone, and so took the prerogative to just pick two. The first being the recent protests in Iran that are happening right now. We're seeing several days, I think 9 now days of protests, with demonstrations happening really against the backdrop of pretty significant economic pressure, in particular inflation that's really impacting Iranians and is combined with, of course, continued sanctions. So here, I think, is what makes this interesting. One is the regime itself is dealing with a lot of different fronts all at one time. So there are proxy conflicts across the region. There are obviously lots of legitimacy questions with young Iranians, which is not wholly new, but is a lot of pressure. There appear to be internal political fractures. And then, of course, there's a complex environment with Trump and Russia, Ukraine, and a host of other issues, which means that in the end, there are a couple of big pieces that probably matter and why it's worth thinking about. One is just the actual regional instability, which, affects all sorts of areas we care about, including, of course, like the Straits of Hormuz, but also a whole range of proxy networks that span the region across Lebanon and Yemen and Iraq. So that's like one piece, just to The second piece is this sort of in medium question of what it means in terms of strategic balancing in the Middle East and what a weekend or inward forcing Iran might look like, both in terms of the internal politics of it, but then in terms of what the regime might be willing to do or interested in doing. And then the last piece, and something I imagine we'll talk about again in the context of recent Venezuela events, is how does that intersect with the sort of, I'll call it, for lack of a better term, this great power competition kind of environment we're in with Russia and China and the US, and an increased kind of conversation on what types of activities are legitimate or not legitimate for states to do to stabilize themselves from internal and external pressures. So that is a lot of different things happening for a regime and a region that is not known for its ongoing stability, and that's Iran. The other one I picked relates to New York, and sort of two unconnected, but that seem unconnected stories, but were at least temporally proximate, and I think tell us something about the current world we're living in. So in case you missed it, there was a foiled New Year's Eve attack. We had an individual...
Cohen?
What?
On Anderson Cooper?
Not per se, but in Times Square.
Okay, well, then,
inspired by ISIS ideology, because ISIS is still a thing, in case we were not sure. Now, credit to law enforcement, they disrupted it before it materialized. But I think there's a piece here that's just important to remember, which is we're still seeing homegrown radicalization. A lot of that radicalization is happening online. It's targeting vulnerable individuals. And we have a particular set of attention we pay to it when it's inspired by ISIS ideology. But those previous four things I noted relate to a host of other types of violence we have seen. The next day, or actually just really later that night, because Mamdani had his first inauguration right after midnight, Zoran Mamdani was inaugurated as the new mayor of New York City. And he is really, he's a democratic socialist, part of a progressive cohort. And he has very strong positions on things like policing reform, immigration enforcement, what law enforcement can and can't do, and the importance of civil liberties, which again are playing out in lots of different arenas as they relate to immigration, but do tend to actually directly impact a whole host of how, in New York in particular, but I think more generally, law enforcement approaches counterterrorism, surveillance issues, of cooperation between state and local and federal officials, and how we handle things like intelligence sharing. So last piece here, there's also a whole conversation to be had on AI and social media regulation and how that intersects this radicalization conversation and what type of information law enforcement and the government should or shouldn't be able to pull out from social media to try to, air quotes, protect and make safe the country. So sort of interesting, I think, combination of things happening in New York that I'm keeping an eye on.
And so, I 1010% missed the terrorist threat thing. Like, I don't know if I went to bed early that night. I slept late the next day. I was distracted by the discussion of heated rivalry by Anderson Cooper and Andy Cohen. Like, maybe that's what they were offended by. But like, it feels kind of weird that I didn't notice it. Maybe I was just distracted. But before I move on to my less maybe exciting It's a Drill cocktail party diversion, says, Erin, what do you got?
I just have kind of a short one, although I will note on the ISIS thread that there was a strike by France and the UK in Syria against ISIS stockpiles. So I guess they're really having a moment. We'll see if that persists. There was also a mass shooting in Australia at Bondi Beach, which also was ISIS inspired. On a slightly different note, I noted that the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, visited Trump at Mar-a-Lago over the holidays. And I feel like Mar-a-Lago is really just becoming this sort of like receiving room, just like you go and pay some sort of like homage. And maybe there's, material goods exchanged or not. I think Bibi awarded Trump some sort of prize on behalf of the Israeli people at this visit. But there were two kind of more substantive pieces. One, and it's really hard to say here, like how much of what the president says is a matter of policy versus just a thing that Trump is saying that day. Things that Trump says that day have a way of becoming policy sometimes. But the president noted that he would back Israel if they had additional strikes against Iran. Namely in the face or kind of with the hinting that Iran may be trying to resurrect either its uranium production or a weapons program or both. I have no idea what the intel actually shows on that, but Trump was very supportive of a second round of strikes against Iran if that were to be the case. And secondly, he, kind of pretty shifted gears a little bit and pretty fully backed Israel vis-a-vis Hamas and the implementation of the peace plan that the U.S. brokered last fall between, for the Gaza Strip and between Israel and Hamas more broadly. He noted there would be hell to pay if Hamas did not disarm. So I don't know if there's like a through line on any of that, other than we have kind of a rather severe collapse of a policy process. We have statements by the president, directing or dictating policy as he so fits. But will certainly be interesting to watch both of those things play out in 2026.
I definitely, Erin, as you suggested that you were going to do the Netanyahu visit on this, I was thinking back to the period over the holidays where this visit occurred, where Venezuela was like not that much longer later, and just thinking about the overall national security apparatus and like how it does planning and like prioritizing there. And not that, I mean, it is absolutely
and then maybe
possible for
they realized that they didn't.
Right. Yes. Also, that's exactly my takeaway. I was like, oh wow, that's amazing. They did that at the same time. Like, no, actually, not really. Like, they don't think they really cared. So my two, definitely the first one I feel like is possible nervous cocktail party chatter that is going on. So at the very end of the year, there had been a pause for a while on enforcing Hatch Act violations against federal employees who had left the federal government. And at the very end of the year, the Office of Special Counsel said, okay, actually, we resolved that thing that was holding us up on this. We are again going to be enforcing Hatch Act violations, Hatch Act compliance by federal employees, including those, and not just including those, but like, and doing so for those who have left government. So not to say that you are violating the Hatch Act when you're out of government, but that you were in government, you committed a Hatch Act violation, and that they are now going after you anyway. Because for a long period of time, one that was up for legal question, and then also, let's be real, OSC only has so many resources. It prioritizes what it goes after and to what end. But in a normal world, this probably wouldn't get a ton of attention, except for people who had previously thought, I no longer have to worry about this, now thinking maybe I do. But in an era of selective enforcement and political prosecutions, which is very much a world that we're living in right now, I'm absolutely positive that there's former feds who are paying attention to what happens next, what cases get elevated and receive resources and attention, and particularly as, just for a fun fact, that Hatch Act complaints actually went up by close to 50% last year. So just as a reminder, like, this includes a whole lot of possible stuff. Hatch Act is, as many of us know, is pretty squishy. But for example, if I had chosen to run for office as a Democrat while serving in federal capacity. I'm not allowed to do that. I can do so as a nonpartisan role, which like some city councils and places like that are. I also have to be, in theory, I say in theory, you're supposed to be very careful with what you do while acting as a federal authority. So it would be what kind of emails you send, what message you say in public, what kind of work that you do internally, how you prioritize politics or not in the work that you do. One of the reasons that hashtag campaigns went up so much last year, folks will remember messages like you saw the out of office messages blaming Democrats for the federal shutdown, things like that. That is a fairly clear Hatch Act violation. But the fact that they're now doing this against former feds, I think people will definitely be wondering, like, okay, what's up with that next? The other thing that just caught my eye in the Financial Times when I was at the airport and just was walking by, as one does, is folks will remember over the course of 2025, there was a kind of a trickle out of stories around deprioritizing prosecution and enforcement investigation around money laundering, around other kinds of sanctions violations related to that. And those violations were down. And like what we found out at the end of the year is that overall, those violations and the fines associated with them are down about 61% year on year. And not surprisingly, that's not because financial crimes suddenly got solved miraculously. It's because enforcement capacity went down. The Trump administration made pretty clear that they weren't going to be prioritizing this. And regulatory attention and investigative attention went elsewhere in a lot of different places that you might be able to guess based on what you see in the news. But in particular, you can note that there's a lot of scaled back investigations in areas like crypto, and also some sanctions enforcement, not all sanctions enforcement, as we've prioritized resources elsewhere. So before, like the US was, if not the global leader, then like definitely a major global leader in financial crime enforcement. And like they set standards around that. So the fact that that's going down so precipitously is both a big deal in the US context, but also a big deal in terms of like serving as a global leader and example elsewhere.
Yeah, the thing I would just say, like tying those two pieces of enforcement together is obviously prosecutors and investigators hold a lot of discretion in what they can choose to put their resources against. And this administration has obviously made clear their priorities and how they want to do that. But those are enduring authorities. And it just will be interesting to see, especially with the midterms coming up and then, future presidential elections, the signaling on not just the policy priorities, but some of these enforcement and snapback enforcement priorities like retroactive Hatch Act violations is certainly something that a future administration could also choose to prioritize, and the precedence has been set for that. So certainly an interesting time to see how that plays out.
That does indeed require spines that have been absent in the past. But moving on to dumpster fires. So big issues that are going on in the news that have longer term major implications for institutions. All right. So this one, when we were talking about it as a possible idea, I was like, oh, that's just kind of one story. And then I thought about it for a while and did a bit of research and realized, no, this is actually kind of our entire federal system. So we should probably talk about this a little bit. All right. So I'm going to give a quick background on what has been happening over the last few weeks in Minnesota, and then dive into what does that mean for everybody here? So Minnesota, like all states, administers a lot of different federal programs, whether child nutrition, Medicaid, housing, childcare, a whole bunch of stuff that are through block grants. And they have a bunch of oversight frameworks around them. There's a range depending on the program that you're talking about. But like the federal government gives out chunks of money that states administer in various ways. Oversight of those programs, usually, kind of depending on how it's set up, relies on more trust-based reimbursement and paper compliance, and not like proactive at the front end. Here's how we're going to set this up. That depends a bit on the program. And so that sort of funding, folks may remember, expanded like a whole bunch during COVID, for a variety of really good reasons. But also with that, you probably heard lots and lots of stories about various kinds of fraud that were committed under COVID. And the controls were like loosened during that period, and basically just in order to get funding to people faster, under the assumption that like that is more important right now than us setting up a whole big compliance system. But it opens up opportunity for fraudsters, and there's been a bunch of different investigations and prosecutions over the last few years on that. It's not new in any context. It's particularly not new in Minnesota. In 2022, prosecutors indicted almost 50 individuals connected with a nonprofit called Feeding Our Future that was accused of stealing millions of dollars in pandemic-era child nutrition programs. There's been additional investigations in this space, and there's actually been a significantly increased FBI presence to investigate around reimbursements for autism therapy, for housing assistance, and now we're talking about childcare. You may kind of vaguely remember trickles of this going on in 2024, and some of this former President Trump at the time made comments around Minnesota at that point. So that's a big deal already, and that attracts discussion of the role of the federal government versus states in terms of grant making, the controls that the federal government sets up, that Minnesota and states like that set up, and the payment integrity to make sure that these billions of dollars are getting out for the intended purposes. So all that has happened before. Enter Nick Shirley, who has really annoying hair, who is a right-wing YouTuber. He publishes a video that is not really reporting anything new per se in terms of actual facts, but also making up a whole bunch of stuff in terms of looser facts, alleging that there's large-scale fraud in Minnesota's child care assistance programs and pointing to several Somali-run centers. So with that, he got a ton of political and media attention. The Trump administration went nuts and immediately went beyond those ongoing investigations to freeze childcare funds to Minnesota. And the video became a major flashpoint to a spike of threats and harassments, not only in Minnesota, but around the country. So that's a whole lot with just like one little baby video. So let's dig into a couple of angles here in terms of what exactly is this money? Like the federal child care block grants. It's through the Child Care and Development Fund, a major block grant program that disperses a whole lot of money to states. But like, let's talk more specifically, like what exactly it's the kind of the theory behind how this works.
Yeah. So pulling way back, there are programs that are delivered to a range of local communities that are federally funded. But the way in which the operations and activities are delivered are through state-run and local delivery, and that's for a couple of reasons. One, it's a far more effective system at tailoring and making sure you actually get delivery. Two, in many cases, states can supplement or adapt to local needs to build for both speed and scale, and so that type of and three, states can then manage a bunch of the other things that have to happen with it, like licensing and basic oversights that the federal government would have a hard time doing from afar. And so it is a core feature in many ways of our federal system, this sort of federalist division of labor between federal government and states in a variety of these programs. So that's kind of big picture, and childcare is one version of that, but it's not hardly the only one, as you mentioned. So in that world, essentially, the federal government has a lot of ex post oversight, and there are reporting and oversight and reporting and accountability management by the states. And that is tricky. Add to that the fact that childcare, of course, is really in demand. It's undersupplied and over demanded. And there's lots of licensing requirements, but fundamentally oversight is tricky, especially in a place where you have a bunch of small providers. So at the core here, you have excess demand situation that is encouraging many more smaller providers to meet a growing need. And that is in a system that is fundamentally defers to ex post rather than before the fact oversight. And you get this sort of like perfect storm of childcare centers. So I think bottom line, almost surely there is better management systems for Minnesota, but also this is part of a sort of broader approach, which is how do you get oversight in a block grant type delivery model?
I think that the other point I'd make on that is like, this is like childcare is not, as you said, Radha, it's not unique. This is just like how administrative federalism works. We do block grants and reimbursement systems that are just how the federal government enacts some of its priorities. And when something like this becomes politically sensitive, radioactive, the federal government has a range of options that it can pursue, none of which are great. It can think about, like, does it want to centralize delivery? not going to staff that, but particularly not under this administration. It can try to retreat from whole policy areas. It can go crazy and freeze funds like this, or it can actually try to help states do oversight better. None of those are things that federal government is particularly great at, but it can make a lot of bad choices all at the same time. So this choice that they've made to freeze funding, freeze the childcare element of funding for Minnesota, that is itself just like a huge deal. And we've seen some stories come out around providers not being able to do salaries and other things like that. But I just want to kind of pull the thread a little bit of that in terms of the impact that is likely to have, even if it's fairly short term.
Well, I think obviously, the folks who are probably using these childcare centers are working parents, and so they either have to find alternate means of childcare for their children, which might be unlicensed, or less safe, or less convenient, or somebody has to stop working. So typically that is a mother or the woman in this partnership, but it won't be universally so. But I think you'll have definitely disparate impacts on women's participation in the workforce. Even if it's in a short-term interruption, they might have difficulties getting back into the workforce once things have resolved, if in fact they do.
There's the near-term effect, exactly as Erin laid out, which is you're just going to have less childcare, and that's going to have a negative impact on a whole host of people. I think there is also I'll call it medium-term impact, in which, look, childcare centers are not exactly a money-making scheme. So the incentives to do them aren't super high as a starting point. When there are these kind of uncertainty, potentially targeted fraud, especially ones that feel like they maybe aren't super fair or balanced, I think then there's a long-term effect of who is going to actually want to run these child care centers. How are we going to manage this delivery? And I think there's a kind of longer-term equilibrium effect of like, how do we have smaller childcare providers? How do we meet demand? How do we have this be effective? And what risks are we placing on children in the unlicensed sense, or burdens on parents who are already facing an affordability crisis?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the dynamics that are going on here in terms of how we fund this don't always, but should relate to what are we trying to incentivize? We're trying to incentivize parents to be able to put their kids in safe childcare facilities, at least in theory. That's what we're trying to incentivize. But a lot of the barriers and ways that we manage this don't always result in precisely that. And that what the federal government is doing right now with Minnesota may be actually genuinely well-intentioned in some light, but is going to not actually result in that intention. I want to come back to this Nick Shirley element here, because dude made one video that, and actually the video that he made, it came out to be like, had a whole lot of either actual false statements or just misrepresentations in it that resulted in this both massive shift as well as a big wave of reactions across the country. So it's not just this funding challenges going on. There has been vandalism of childcare centers. There's been harassment of child care providers just from one video. And so I want to talk a little bit about I guess disinformation is probably the right way to characterize, but I'm not exactly sure how, like the media ecosystem in which this is operating.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there are a couple of different pieces happening. It's an extremely incendiary and reactionary time just in America writ large, right? You're seeing that on one of both sides, but you're seeing that all around. And in particular, there's a strong xenophobic and anti-immigrant bent that is easily triggered and highly active right now. So like, that's one piece. And the second is you basically have an unregulated information environment in which it is very hard to figure out what truth is, and very easy to get virality for things that have almost no relationship to the truth, limited context, etc. And lots of people can see it. And the third piece is I think there's just a little bit of a normalization right now on community watch type oversight of your neighbors, especially, as I said, in these kind of related to the anti-immigration and or sort of anti-outsiders view. And that is being loaded onto this particular situation where a number of the child care providers are Somali. And so I think putting those together, you've got a powder keg for a really aggressive enforcement environment. I'll just note, add to that, like a bunch of strangers knocking on a child care center demanding to be let in and then being upset that they're not seems to me like it's just really hard to know what to do with that, because of course we generally don't want angry strangers who don't have children at a facility to be let into that facility where there are children and their caregivers actively working. So it's a obviously a very heightened situation at present.
Yeah. If you don't have kids, or if you haven't brought kids or picked the kids up from childcare centers, I think it is, if not universally standard, it is in the vast majority of places where the door is locked. You cannot get in unless you're supposed to walk in. You cannot get anywhere close to where the kids are unless you are an authorized person who is supposed to be there to pick up or engage with the child in some way. This is not a place that has like a warm, friendly reception. It's a place that's like, if you're not supposed to be here, do not come in and stay away. Kate Starbird, who is a researcher in the disinformation and online rumor space, she had this great tweet or skeet or whatever the hell it is the other day about how the rumors around daycare centers are really, really well fit for virality, having novelty and familiarity because they draw on anti-immigrant tropes of criminality and exploitation. It makes emotional identity appeals. It's participatory because it sort of suggests and invites to people to create their own evidence and their own enforcement by investigating local centers. Like, it has all the ingredients of the kind of situations that we're seeing right now.
I would say it also just strikes me that like none of these claims are really that like children are at risk, right?
Nope.
Like none of these claims are that there's something is unsafe or that standards are not being met. The premise of the viral video is that there are in fact no children at these centers, right? That they are like it's a hoax, type situation where there are fake childcare centers that are receiving real government dollars, but no children are present, and like that just. I guess, I don't know, lots of things can happen in the world, but that just sort of boggles my mind as like a premise, right? A Pizzagate-like premise for stirring up incredible activity here.
And to Radha's earlier point, like it then massively disincentivizes anyone for wanting to participate in the system. For the people who, bless them, want to be childcare providers are disincentivized from trying to sign up. Parents are thinking, wow, I don't want my kids to be in a place that are having crazy people come and knock on the doors. Minnesota is thinking, how do we engage in the system? Like, I mean, it's all of it. This is I hate to say perfect storm because that's pretty cliche, but it is. Okay, last but not least, I like the numbers that were cited in terms of the fraud levels, both in Minnesota, but also more broadly from pandemic dollars and elsewhere. I've still actually, frankly, found those kind of concerning, not like Nick Shirley viral video concerning, but like it was more striking than I anticipated. So I'm just curious, like, is there any good that could come of different or greater federal attention to the kinds of funding that we're talking about right now?
It depends on, I think, what you think good is. Almost surely this will create the incentive to be more rigorous and draconian in how federal funds are administered and overseen, and keep those on a tighter leash. That will have the benefit of potentially dealing with some of these concerns on fraud, but the cost of making it harder for new providers and smaller providers to come in and probably disincentivize, as mentioned. So honestly, I think there's the piece of this that is just, if you want there to be services like this, would you rather risk less auditable but actually provision of service, or more auditable but under provision of service? Like, which type of error do you want? And I think, I have preferences there, but I think that is like the core government preference question. I think it is, though, misleading to suggest that that's entirely exogenous of the system around us. Like, we have created a situation where we are bad at administering grants. We don't want people to exist in government service and have just recently let go of a whole bunch of them. But that's also true at state levels, who could provide the necessary oversight and management of these grants and then complain that they're not well managed. So, like, there's a little bit of this that is we've created this perfect storm, but there is, I think, and it is important to recognize and for us to all have an honest conversation of like, would I rather risk that there might be one fraudulent thing, or would I rather risk further burdening and creating a more higher crisis point on affordability? And like, do I wish to kind of entirely exit the labor market of some key elements of the workforce, or right, a dot dot dot. And so these are real trade-offs that we should have real discussions about.
Well, I was going to say, I think it's also just interesting that, the block grant idea, comes out of kind of 90s era, welfare reform and contract with America kinds of things. And to remove that from day-to-day purview of the federal government so that the federal government can be more streamlined, or closer. You want that money to be closer to the recipients and the user community there. But that requires a much more capable set of state governments, and we didn't get that out of the block grant bargain either. And so, unfortunately, I think that there are a lot of people who would say, A, we're definitely willing to have the federal government exit several policy areas, and B, we're definitely okay with them removing childcare, because what are you people doing working in the first place? And like that is I don't think that was the intent here, but that is consistent with a number of policy preferences. I just think that it'll be, detrimental to families and to individual, women and other caregivers. So,
and also won't make things more affordable.
Yeah, and just to be like super explicit about what Erin was just talking about, it really makes Minnesota an interesting test case to further look at clawing back federal funds from the places that they're supposed to be going, which is what this administration has been doing in a lot of different areas across the board, but this is a new area for them. So we'll fix federalism in a future episode and move on to what could be an entire episode unto itself, and I'm sure will continue to be a gift that keeps on giving over the course of the next several months in Venezuela.
Yeah, so I will confess that as I was like preparing to like, what's the background context I could give to help motivate this section? One, things were changing in real time. And two, it's like you could say roughly 6 words or 300 words. So let me kind of hit through a couple of bullets, and then I think we can just have a pretty wide-ranging conversation. But bottom line, the U.S. Did a massive military strike and set of operation to capture President Nicolas Maduro and his wife, and bring them back to the United States to face narco-terrorism charges. So, in case you weren't tracking, Nicolas Maduro was the at least purported leader of Venezuela. He had been, air quotes, elected in an election last year that most independent observers think was neither free nor fair. The U.S. doesn't recognize Maduro's legitimacy. The opposition leader, a guy named Edmundo Gonzalez, is actually in exile. And I'm sorry, the opposition party who won, Edmundo Gonzalez, is in exile. But Machado, who is the opposition leader, is running inside sort of an underground operation, and recent Nobel Prize winner. The last piece here to note is that, it just sort of by way of context, this has been largely framed as a counter-narcotics enforcement part of the broader efforts from the Trump administration. But there are strong overtones and explicit interest in unblocking and accessing the oil, especially for American oil companies, with the kicker in the Trump press conference being Trump himself, who sidelined the opposition leader and made clear that America would be running the country until such a time as we decide they'll do what we want, more or less. So I think, obviously we can take this in a lot of directions, but maybe we can just start with kind of what under what authority is it legal? How did he do this? Are we at war? Kind of how should we think about what this operation is or was and isn't or shouldn't be.
Okay, so I'm going to try to channel what the administration is saying with the assumption that they are not being necessarily clear themselves in terms of authority, but like here's the vibe. They are framing this as a law enforcement counter narcotics operation, not a war action per se. Where
Rubio has been in
Secretary,
particular like very consistent on that point.
Yep. And with Secretary Rubio, exactly as Erin says, it's being pretty consistent that that's why they didn't have to notify Congress, because like they wouldn't notify Congress who's just going out to arrest somebody, because it was a law enforcement operation. And the public messaging around that has been around the role in drug trafficking and cartel networks and so on. But like, it's very nice that he's using this framing, and I'm frankly kind of impressed with how consistent he has been so far. But like, that doesn't really escape the fact that I assume a Delta team of some kind or whatever, SEAL team, whatever, invaded Venezuela, another sovereign nation, took their head of state forcibly, and it was involved in various kinds of strikes against the country in order to get in and out. That is generally how I think of military operations, that in which case, no matter how you frame this, would make the entire thing extremely hella mega illegal. There's not anything in the UN Charter that says, actually, if you're just going to arrest the guy, that's totally, absolutely fine. And there's not in any, they haven't even bothered to try with a self-defense trigger. And I don't think that would have been remotely plausible, but they haven't even like pushed in that general direction.
The self-defense trigger is why they had to bomb all the things.
Fishermen.
To prevent potential defense by the Venezuelans against the operational aircraft that were coming in to definitely not conduct a military operation in their country.
I do kind of feel like they took all the like the last 3 months of commentary about bombing fishermen and like listened to all the civilians, and they were like, oh, you poor babies, look what we've got coming for you next.
Exactly. I mean, to be honest, like I don't usually get super fussed about international law. I mean, there are reasons to conform to it, and then there are the many, 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 many times that we choose not to. I think I'm equally, or I'm much more concerned, like what the authorization is under domestic law, like in sort of like what is the, because certainly the administration's, the executive branch of the administration their position is we can simply do whatever we want because we can. And I mean, I think that's been their point on impoundment of like federal funds. It seems to be their point on, nominees and some other personnel sorts of things. And so now we have it like fully applied to, military actions, extra legal law enforcement overseas with a cherry on top. And like this is just a symptom, right? It's not like mind blowing that they did. Oh my God, they didn't brief Congress. No shit, they didn't brief Congress. They don't in any way feel obligated to,
Yeah.
Well, yes, but not the intel committees, right? I mean, or like only one of the Republicans from an intel committee. I kind of lost track, but they don't in any way see like actual constitutional constraints on the exercise of power, whether foreign or domestic. So this is pretty consistent with all of that.
Yeah, it basically like it lets you say if DOJ has indicted somebody, which is what they've done with Maduro, indicted, then that gives you the ability to go kidnap them from elsewhere overseas. And if they are the head of state, then you can effectuate a regime change because DOJ has said so, which sort of seems like a circular argument at a certain point in time of like, so is anyone overseeing this, or is there any sort of authority that like is bound here? Could another country do this to President Trump and that would be in bounds? Like,
no, because they aren't as powerful. That's the only thing that matters.
But I actually think a really useful thought exercise on this is, if this were in the United States, would this be legal or would this be excessive use of force? Like if you had a person who you knew was a narco-terrorist and they were on a compound and they were secured, could you use bombs and a military-style invasion of that compound without trying any other things first to arrest the person and kill, I don't know, I think the death toll is up to 80 people? Like, how would that be viewed in a domestic case? Because even leaving aside the international law questions, right, there's the question there. I think it would be at a minimum frowned upon.
Yeah.
Right?
We'd be presumed that
People
you
would
did
be
not
quite
make
cross.
good choices.
I feel
Yeah.
that would not be an appropriate use of force. And so now when you add I'll just side note the dollars. I mean, we're talking about fraud here in the Minnesota context, and I just pin in cost of military operation, move to the side.
And to be clear, like it was a very large military operation.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like,
Yes. Like, this was not like it's been briefed as sort of like, oh, it's just this like small thing. I was kind of, I don't know how to say this. I was impressed.
yeah.
Yeah.
I know.
Like,
I mean, it's like a well executed military operation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And but like
see that
quite complex. Like they got the Air Force and the Navy to do things together and special operations. This is very difficult.
Yeah. No. And
joint operations are not something we're actually all that good at. All that point.
Turns out we are when it's, I don't know, South America.
I don't know. Yeah.
No, I think the last piece I'll just note, which is there's a great daily like episode on this on Sunday, which has an actual lawyer who knows law things. And I learned that treaties, when they're ratified, become laws in the United States. So it's not like an international law question, like international laws are kind of norms, and we might get a strongly worded letter from the UN, which of course we can't, because any strongly worded letter we would just veto. But
I think the General Assembly did condemn us today. But
okay.
Yeah.
Well, good to know. But it is like, actually there are these laws on when you can go into other sovereign nations that we have ratified in a treaty, and being upset that you can't arrest their president is not on the list of reasons you can go in.
But like to the point around that Erin was making earlier, I think the justification is President Trump's repeated one is like, who's going to stop me?
Right.
I do think this is like emblematic, of and this is not a novel point. I mean, it's frankly right there in the national security strategy, right? This is very pure spheres of influence, which I think makes intuitive sense to the president. I think is consistent with some other policy preferences, for like other people who would like to do less in Europe, for example. I think it is in great tension with a lot of other people's preferences for Asia policy, right? And I think we will see that come to a head at some point, because, I think spheres of influence, we talked earlier about great power competition. What if we don't? Like, that sounds hard. What if we disagree that there are like, I don't know, 3 great powers and everybody gets to do their thing? Like, I just think that makes a ton of sense to the president. There are people around him who have similar preferences, not for the same reasons. I mean, it's kind of like the Iraq invasion in 2003, right? Dick Cheney, Don Rumsfeld, and Paul Wolfowitz, didn't agree on why they should go to Iraq, but they all agreed that we should. And they all had like other things they're like trying to prove, from it. There's similar sorts of things, right? Like Stephen Miller thinks that we can, kind of shut the borders as long as we like invade all of Latin America. And I don't understand how that math works in his head, but is,
well, if they're all part of America.
Well, there's that question. So anyway, I mean, but it's like the clearest example of the spheres of influence mindset, which I think is evolving into policy, right? If Bibi wants to bomb Iran again, sure, why not? That's for him to do. And, it's just like, I see the intuitive appeal, or at least the underlying logic that, goes for folks, if it weren't just for like all of the history of the 19th and early 20th century. So,
well, let's talk. I mean, given that history and maybe given the current state of the world, what do we think about the precedents here in terms of, is this like what we did? Is this like the Iraq War? Is this like Panama? Does this tell us things about how we expect or should expect folks to behave, like, say, from Russia or from China?
I guess I think about it less in terms of like the precedent, like, because this administration has no problems being hypocritical or two-faced or having one standard for themselves and one standard for other people. So I don't see it happening there. It's more about what are the levers, that would come about if somebody else in the world did something that we thought was against our interest, and we then wanted other people to help us out with that. That's what I think is like the main thing, right? So if there's an attack on, maybe South Korea, right? If there's an attack, I'm trying to think of another like place that has, good, in the Philippines or something. And we're like, okay, well, this seems bad. It's like an attack on the global order. Maybe it like affects some shipping lanes or something, Germany, Japan, France, come help. And they'll be like, pound sand. Or not. I mean, they might have their own reasons for wanting to help in that, but I think it changes some of the discussion in a lot the same way that people's support of the Iraq war was very contentious. So for me, it's less about precedent and more about like how it shapes people's willingness to, chime in and, actually contribute to military force or diplomatic pressure or other sort of elements of power that folks have in terms of leverage. They may be like, sounds like a you problem, bro, and leave it at that.
There's been been an interesting kind of intersecting dialogue. I say dialogue. There's an Axios story, which is not a dialogue. There's an Axios story of some House Democrats and maybe some other folks being like, we can't be like idiots and just condemn this. Like Maduro is a bad guy. Is actually, this is like a muscular show of force. Like we don't have to go out there and condemn literally everything that Trump is doing. And my immediate reaction to that, which is probably still my consistent reaction, was like, you guys are idiots. Like, what on earth are you talking about? Of course you have to condemn this. But like to Erin's point, I was thinking a bit back to the Iraq war and how like the circles that people talked themselves into around really desperately wanting Saddam Hussein out of office, wanting a new regime in Iraq, but by 2004 being really freaked out about what was going on the ground in Iraq at that point in time and discussing that like whether we should have gone in the first place. I don't think we're going to hit a point of an Iraq invasion with Venezuela. Gosh, I hope not. But the whole, this is a bad guy, we don't like him, we want him out of office, and therefore we can go kidnap him and remove him back to the United States. Like those are generally not things that follow in a sentence, but the I think that the precedent here is that challenging people having a really hard time with that conversation. If you don't want somebody in office, if you don't like them, you think they're a bad guy, and then what? We actually have a whole bunch of tools to that end, but they don't work fast, and they don't even necessarily work well.
Yeah, so I think that like maybe transitioning to like the last part of the discussion, which is a little bit of like, now what? I think for me, this is both most like everything we always do and probably something that will continue to be questionable and problematic going forward, which is it's like we don't care about the second or fifth or 37th move that happens after this invasion piece. And we're really, I mean, like you said, this is a really impressive military operation. And we do that. Remember horse soldiers that parachuted in and took Kabul? And like, I mean, we do things like these big shows of force really, really well and coordinated attacks. There's a long tail to the back end of this. And like short of what appears to be Marco Rubio maybe running Venezuela to his lists of tasks that he does now, there is not really a per se go forward plan. And that seems to be something that is both consistent with past actions and probably problematic in a go forward sense. But I don't know what you guys are thinking in terms of like what is next and what
I can't believe, except that of course I can 100% believe it, is that this conversation didn't come up. There wasn't somebody in the room who was like, hey guys, but like, what about next week? And to the extent that there was, the Miami Herald had this incredible article about the back channel through the Qataris between the US government and the subordinates in the Maduro administration, right? So the vice president who controls a pretty powerful like intel agency, her brother who's like Speaker of the House or equivalent in Venezuela. And so, there's sort of British style like scheming on like who they're going to put in power. But then the assumption is just that like, well, they'll do what we want because we'll bomb them again if they don't. And like, again, like I wrote an entire dissertation on counterinsurgency campaigns, man. Like that's rough. Like it's rough out there for a bad government, bad third party government.
I have so many so whats that I'm curious about. I am deeply curious about how this impacts the day-to-day calculus of other countries that the United States has said that it doesn't like very much, between Iran and Cuba, as examples, but not exclusively them. In addition
Denmark.
to places like Ukraine and Taiwan, to Erin's point earlier around spheres of influence, is this and how much should we be reading this, or how much are they reading this as an indicator that the United States is like, actually, this is a totally legit way to operate, and like it's fine for others to be able to pursue this. But even like outside of those categories of countries, just thinking about the operation that it took in order to go into a country and kidnap a head of state, how much is it changing the day-to-day OPSEC of your average head of state in any particular country at this point in time? And I would assume quite a bit. And like we're even thinking about places like Greenland and Canada and other places like that that have come under the Trump administration's attack.
Madness.
Yes. Well, I imagine there are probably 1 million other things we could talk about as it relates to Venezuela, but I also imagine we'll have opportunity to do that again. So maybe for now we can turn to warning signs.
Yeah, so we'll be quick on this one and not for a long discussion, but I just want us to highlight some good or bad things that are on our minds that we're looking at in 2026, whether things we are predicting, things we're watching, things we're hoping around, and just if there are any examples that you want to call out as we go into the year. We will not be held accountable for any of these actions in the future.
Well, it's an election year, which I regret to inform you. And so I have no idea whatsoever how that plays out, but I think it will be very interesting to see both like the performance of individual candidates and parties, but also how this administration chooses to interpret certain kinds of election law and guidance that it provides, Supreme Court reviews going into it. There's, I think, scene setting in more than one way for what 2028 could look like. That's one thing.
I've got a few. So I am I am unfortunately curious about federal disaster preparedness. We got, I would say, I hate to say lucky because there were still bad things that happened in the country from a disaster perspective in 2025, but we got relatively lucky compared to prior years. Given the big changes that have happened in FEMA and in disaster assistance around the country, as well as just like the escalating risks of certain other kinds of climate risks that we see, how are we going to fare in 2026? Because a lot of the capacity departures that were happening in the federal government didn't really hit until the end of 2025. So it's just going to be a different story in 2026, no matter what. Also looking at oh my God, we have to deal with like a possible federal budget shutdown nonsense yet again.
I was so mad at you for reminding me of that in the notes.
I know, like I just forgot about it and now it's back.
When does the CR expire? It expires in January.
Yeah,
right?
it's June. I held myself back from looking at it because I just couldn't deal. More positively, I mean, I'm a bit of a Mamdani fangirl, but his inaugural speech around the role of government and what people should learn from and take from that message, and like the possibility of like making good government hot right now, like I am very interested to see how this goes, not only in terms of his own success, but in terms of the lesson that other folks who are trying to get elected this year take from that. And then, of course, we got World Cup, which is, man, that could be a huge fuck up for this administration, or could be a massive success for the world. We'll see. Radha, what about you?
Yeah. So mine are in sort of three big categories. One is, the Supreme Court.
I've heard of it. Yes.
I'm aware.
Having some non-decisions where they refused to stop the Trump administration and agreed to take up court cases, but they didn't actually rule on the cases.
Yeah, they didn't rule on the merits. Yep.
Yeah, there are a whole bunch of cases that need to happen in 2026, not the least of which is the administration allowed to do all these tariffs? So I know you guys forgot about tariffs, but I didn't.
I did.
And
the tariff cases were definitely keeping me up at night.
Yeah. Yeah. There are a range of other ones that relate to a whole host of the executive branch powers and authorities. And it will be interesting to see where the actual, again, I'm not per se optimistic, but it's easier to contort the law to not prevent the executive from acting than it is to contort the law for enduring opinions that are the legacy of this court. And so will be interesting to see where those happen. That's piece one. Piece two is there's just a whole bunch of stuff happening in the AI regulation space. And without going too far in the weeds, there's this EU AI Act that's actually starting in force next year and has a ton of fines. There are some relatively large cases related to rights, privacy rights, and copyright rights related to large AI companies. And then, of course, there are, I don't know, probably like 37 more AI executive orders that are going to come out, and we'll learn about 24 hours before they happen. So, AI-apalooza.
So to kind of combine our last bits of conversation for Gong Show, wanted to talk about our own New Year's resolutions. And do you have a resolution that you would like American institutions to take in 2026? I will start with mine. So my New Year's resolution, I have two. One is small, and that is to do more crafting, because like creating things I find is both really good for the soul, but also good for the brain. Of just like it's very different than writing a memo. You use your hands and you produce something, whether that be food or really, really terrible cross stitch or bad watercolors or whatever it is. Like the act of making something is just like really delightful. And the second is just to find more opportunities for joy, as opposed to be like, oh, that looks like I would really have fun there, I should go do that, and then never thinking of it again. To actually pursue it, invite people along with it, and I give them that opportunity too. For institutions, this is my hobby horse. I would like institutions to care more about their trustworthiness and the trust that they have broken, and that they have the opportunity to build, both on an interaction to interaction basis, but also on a what's your whole job here, in terms of why are you operating every day? What incentives are you trying to create all the time? Why are you actually governing at this point? So caring about trust would be my institutional resolution. Erin?
I have not set like a really good New Year's resolution for this year. Last year, I wanted to kind of reconnect with some folks that I had lost contact with, or had just not been had a chance to spend as much time with while I was at the Pentagon. And I think we could probably re-up that again for this year, and kind of broaden out that friend network again. Or continue down some of that path. Washington is a fabulously itinerant city, which means that people kind of come in and out of your lives. People leave, but they also come back. And so there's very interesting opportunities for how kind of friendships, go not I want to say full circle, but in circles over time. Institutional resolution, I would say what I would like is for institutions to do their job. And mostly here, I'm thinking of Congress. Like they should like pass a bill or a budget or something. They should legislate in some way. They should come to work. House of Representatives, I'm talking to you. So I'd like them to commit to really in office full time participation like the rest of us do.
Okay, my New Year's resolution for me is I wish to start stretching regularly. I have reached an age such that various parts of my body just hurt sometimes because I sleep wrong or sit in a position for more than a few minutes, and makes me sad. And I've come to accept the fact that stretching may be the solution to this. So my goal is to try to stretch for 20 minutes a day. We shall see if that is realized in either the number of minutes I do it or the number of days I do
You'll be
it.
so bored after 5 minutes, like you won't even be able to stand it.
I know.
What if you go get a Thai massage every day?
That would be great.
Yeah.
Yep.
But probably also won't happen. So that's that. For my institutions, I've been thinking about this a lot. And I think where I've come down to is I'd like the people in those institutions to go back and take a gander at the United States Constitution. There's something in there for everyone, regardless of your branch, regardless of your activity. Some good stuff in there. There's some less good stuff in there. But I think if we all just took a minute to recommit ourselves to that set of activities there, and then asked ourselves, is this what I should be doing? Or is this what I should be not doing? Maybe 2026 would have a little bit more balance in it. So that's my institutional resolution for us all.
Radha is not trying to trigger the army into recognizing that it is unconstitutional, but that would be it. They should definitely have that takeaway from themselves. All right, we are at the end of our first episode of 2026. Any parting shots?
So one note from me, and this will not come as a surprise to you guys since we have talked about this, but for our lovely listeners, I'm going to be stepping back a bit in 2026. There's a few different reasons for that, some work, some personal. But what it means is that I will not be regularly on the main episodes here for Sirens. I will still join probably the warning signs segments occasionally for defense and maybe budget related sorts of things. And I'm hoping to do some mini episodes around a few different themes. But first and foremost of which is what we're reading and what you're writing. And so I'd love to use the mini episodes as a way to talk more about books in our world. And how we can, learn more from them and share them more with each other. So we'll more things to sort of figure out on exactly what some of those mini episodes will look like over time, but a bit of an update on my side for 2026.
Speaking of reading and writing, if you have not rated the Sirens podcast on your podcast platform of choice, please do so, or refer to a friend or an enemy, whichever you think would enjoy the most. And with that, have a delightful first weeks-ish of January, and we'll see you soon.